It is often said that we don't see through our eyes, but instead with our brain. The eyes enable light to enter our system, but in order to make sense of the world around us, the electrically powered piece of meat we all carry inside our skulls needs to get working. So what kind of work does the brain need to do? Well, the simple answer, as in most psychological research, is pretty straight. We are not sure yet. But before I tell you how my institution spends resources in order for me to waste hours drinking coffee and thinking over this, let me give you some examples on how the brain sees. An obvious example would be dreaming or imagination. That extraordinary ability of experiencing images without them actually being there. Many scientists are curious about understanding this phenomenon, despite the many practical difficulties. But unfortunately for you, unfortunately for them, I'm not one of those scientists. So I can't really tell you much on the topic. However, I'm kind of curious about stuff like this. This is the widely known Penrose triangle. It's quite funny. I got this t-shirt really cheap because the word triangle is misspelled on it. Let me make it a bit easier for you to see. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary triangle, but the more you stare at it, the more you realize that in reality, this shape cannot exist. It's an optical illusion. Optical illusions are an interesting way to understand that beyond what our eyes perceive, beyond the visual information that's right in front of our eyes, the brain does all the hard work to put that information together. And of course, as I know from my personal life too, hard work does not necessarily mean good work. Sorry, boss. I know that you're probably watching this. Our eyes get constantly bombarded by a huge influx of visual information, and many times the brain can get confused, distracted, or even miss some of the information. Here's an example of the brain getting confused. These are the rotating snakes by Akiyoshi Kitaoka. Even though this picture is static, our brains pick up spontaneous movement, as if the snakes are rotating. I know, brains are really weird, huh? Of course, the way that we perceive the world has a lot to do with where and how we pay attention, where the focus is. Now, I don't usually take selfies, but I think there's no better way to explain this. So I want you to have a look here. Cute guy, huh? Depending on where you focus your attention, your brain interprets the perspective of this photo differently. Despite having only one image in front of your eyes, the brain puts it together in a prejudiced way. What's right in front of you in combination with what we know about that something. For the example here, the brain has learned that faces can only have one single perspective. It searches beyond the single image that's right in front of the eyes and puts it all somehow together based on what makes sense for the brain. As I mentioned earlier, brains can also get distracted or even miss some of the information. For example, you probably haven't noticed that I switched the watch I was wearing from my right hand to my left hand. There's a number of reasons why this happens. One reason is that your brain uses existing knowledge, some sort of common sense, in order to save energy while figuring things out. If you saw the watch before, you know I'm wearing it. It doesn't really make sense for me to switch hands. So why would your brain pay any more attention to it? It assumes when it sees the watch that it's always been on my left hand. Unless, of course, somebody is trying to make a point. I know what you're thinking. The screen is small, the watch is even smaller, the setup is quite big, I have a very pretty face, it's easy to get away with it. But let me give you a better example. Our brains know that in order to change clothes, we need to take the ones we're currently wearing off and change them with other ones. And one does not simply do that while giving a speech. Or at least that's what the organizers told me. That could explain why you probably haven't noticed that the word triangle is now spelled correctly on my t-shirt. Trust me, this would have been much cooler if I was doing this on stage. I pointed at my t-shirt before. You saw it, you probably read what was written on it, and your brain processed the information. It knows that the print on it is not something likely to change, so why give it any more attention? The brain prefers to save its resources and tries to avoid what it thinks is unnecessary. It uses this common sense to assume that the t-shirt will remain the same, or that the watch was always on my left hand. Similarly to how when you see somebody with glasses, you assume that they have some sort of a visual impairment. Well, guess what? These glasses have no lenses in them. Well, I told you I was trying to make a point. This brain limitation is something that magicians have come across, and often they use this distraction to impress us with their magic. So try and remember that next time you spot a magician. Now, knowing that the brain has all these capabilities and limitations, we now understand that somehow the brain, using specific processes, turns all this visual influx into conscious representations. So, beyond what our eyes perceive, something is happening in some areas of the brain that actually allow us to understand the world around us. Such a process is visual short-term memory. In simple words, visual short-term memory is our brain's ability to handle visual information just for a few seconds while that information is no longer available. And therefore, we can achieve some goals. To help you understand, I want you to imagine that you're building one of those model aeroplanes or a model boat. You have all these pieces laid in front of you on the table, and of course you have this huge booklet with instructions. You open up the instruction manual to the first page and have a look at the first piece you're going to need. What you're doing is you're trying to remember the image of the first piece in your mind, and you put the instructions away. You turn to all the pieces on the table, trying to find the one that you're holding into your memory. Trying to remember and handle all this visual information, which is no longer present, is what the visual short-term memory process is. In our lab, we don't really build model aeroplanes or model boats, but part of our work relates to which brain areas are involved during visual short-term memory. Specifically, we study the primary visual cortex, which is an area on the back of the brain somewhere around here. The primary visual cortex is the first brain area that processes visual information right after light passes through our eyes and the optic nerve. It even consists of special cells, special neurons, which have been shown to be particularly responsible for processing some basic visual features. In other words, some neurons in the primary visual cortex are exclusively there to process some basic visual characteristics, such as contrast and orientation. However, we are still not sure whether this brain area is able to hold on to these visual characteristics. Let's say, whether the primary visual cortex is able to remember them, or whether other brain areas need to be recruited in order to do so. So how do we find out? Well, the first thing we need to do is design some tasks, computer tasks, which will present to people visual information and people will have to remember it. Think of it as some sort of a very boring video game. So basically what we do is we present an image to the participants. The image then disappears and the participants are trying to remember it. After a few seconds, a second image appears. Then participants need to tell us if the second image is the same as the first one or if it's a different one. So far so good. These kinds of computer tasks have been used in cognitive science for decades, and it is something we use in our lab as well. Apparently, part of my job is to spend hours designing these very boring memory games, while of course making sure the whole lab's computer system doesn't crash. These tasks help us gather evidence about visual short-term memory, enabling us to study it and explore it. But that's the easy part. We still need to figure out a way to investigate how the primary visual cortex is involved during the process of visual short-term memory. Now, the most reliable way to do this, and bear with me, that's the best way to do it, is the following. We bring people to the lab to play these very boring video games we design, which the goal is to remember something visual. So, we show them the first image, and when the first image disappears, we slice open the skulls, surgically remove the primary visual cortex completely from the brain, and put it right back just before the second image appears, while of course keeping them conscious and alive. And by the way, we only have about 2 seconds to do so before the second image appears. Of course, when I told my lab team this idea, they were staring at me as if I was standing naked in the room. I almost lost my job and some people won't talk to me anymore. So obviously, this is not a realistic scenario. It might indeed be the best way to find out, but clearly is not something that can be done. So what now? After the shock of that meeting cooled down and my supervisor decided to start talking to me again, we turned to state-of-the-art technology to find the answers we were looking for. Non-invasive brain stimulation. Science and technology have developed amazing techniques that today allow us to interfere with the brain's regular activity as if we are removing a brain part in a safe, non-invasive and reliable way. We use magnetic stimulation to target the primary visual cortex, disrupt its regular activity, and study how this temporal disruption affects cognitive processes, such as visual short-term memory. At the start of this talk, I mentioned that the brain is electrically powered. This exact fact is what makes brain stimulation possible. We use magnetic energy, which we know is safe for humans, because this energy can manipulate electrical fields, such as the one our brain generates. Therefore, by manipulating the brain's regular activity during visual short-term memory, we can study how the primary visual cortex is involved during this process. Now, as in all sciences, a very important question needs to be asked, which is probably something you're thinking right now. So what? What's the importance of this? Why do we do it? Well, first of all, it is because we're curious. Scientists want to know why or how the world works. This is what has driven science throughout the years, and this is what drives many scientists around the world today. The brain is very difficult to understand, and these experiments add a very small piece to the puzzle of unraveling how the brain works. They help us better understand mesmerizing questions like why or how are we conscious? Further, this line of work can be translated into the practical world, helping us solve everyday problems. For example, many accidents are caused by the human factor, and often by how our brains get confused, distracted, or even miss information. With this said, I want to close by saying that beyond every scientist's work lies an infinite stream of curiosity and a dream of making the world a better place. Thank you.